Hi, folks. This is Don Meisner with the North Country Fishing Report. You know, trout season is just around the corner, and I know that may be difficult for a lot of us here in this region to really think about because April 1st, the beginning of trout fishing, is really just an extension of winter in many years. And so the waters tend to be high and cold and muddy. But I'll tell you, if you're going to have any kind of success fishing trout in the early part of the season, I think the best bet would be to use live bait. And the reason for that is, as high as that water is, as cold as it is, those fish aren't going to be all that active. They're not going to be chasing bright spinners or looking for flies to float down the surface. They're going to be sort of dug into their own areas and just waiting for food to come to them. So I would suggest that the best bait to use would be live bait. And nothing in my mind beats an angleworm. But let's look at worms. I called my buddy Dave Swanson this morning, and I said, Dave, give me some ideas of what you would like to hear talked about on the radio. And he says, well, have you ever talked about the difference in worms? And I said, yeah, I have. But he started telling me things, and I thought it was fascinating. When he first came to the North Country, years and years ago, and Dave was president of North Country Savings Bank for years. But when he came here as a kid, he came because his uncle lived in Colton, and the fishing up here was drawing him. And his uncle told him when he got here, he says, you know, there's all kinds of different worms that you can use. But the worms from your farm down there in Seneca Falls, the soil seems to be just right, that those worms always seem to work really well here. They're a different texture, a different color, but there's lots of different worms that we can get around here. But it's important to realize that not all worms are created equal. There's worms that you can get in like manure piles. And I remember this as a kid. I can't remember where I found the manure because I didn't grow up on a farm. But when I would get these worms, they looked like little tiny night crawlers, all really red, and they would wiggle like crazy. And I didn't think the trout liked them all that well compared to some of the other worms. However, Dave told me that he would seek out these manure worms because the bullhead loved them. Something about those manure worms, boy, the bullheads would maybe smell them more. Maybe their wiggling did something. I don't know, but he said they work great. The other thing his uncle told him is, you know, night crawlers aren't as good as worms for trout because they're too big. They're too bulky. And, you know, I kind of found the same thing out when I was a kid. By the way, though, as a kid that loved fishing more than I can ever tell you, getting night crawlers at night was a whole nother sport that I used to love. On days that it would rain, I would get a flashlight and a little tin can at night and go out. And the rain would bring the worms up and they'd be lying on the ground. You'd see them. They'd see the light. And so you had to be quick and then try to get them and then pull them out of the ground without breaking them. Because if you broke them in half, they probably wouldn't live all that long. But that was a sport in itself. Now, I've already told you that I didn't think they worked as well as garden worms, but by golly, I caught an awful lot of trout on night crawlers. And I'll never forget all those nights out there getting night crawlers, hearing things in the bushes and wondering if there was an animal going to come out at me or whatever. But it was, again, a part of my youth and a part of what fishing is. Getting bait. Getting bait was one of the fun things about going fishing. So as we start a new season of fishing, and if any of us are lucky enough to go for trout, I highly recommend you use worms. Until next time, folks, this is Don Meisner with the North Country Fishing Report.